It was 2 in the morning when Sadie Whitaker finally let herself cry, and even then she did it quietly so the house wouldn't hear her shame. The kitchen sat in the basement of a stone mansion on a pine ridge outside Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of house that made visitors lower their voices without knowing why. Cold white light poured down from the fluorescent panels above the industrial steel sinks, turning the gray slate floor the color of ash. Sadie stood at the center sink. Water running through her hands had gone numb 10 minutes ago. Her gray uniform clung to her chest and hips soaked through the seams, straining against the soft, full curves of her body. Her left cheek had swollen, shifting from red toward deep purple. The collar of her uniform hung torn at an angle, exposing 4 faint bruises along her collarbone, shaped unmistakably like fingers. A thin smear of blood had dried along the edge of the stone counter, and her hands shook too badly to wipe it clean. Only hours earlier, upstairs at a dinner party glittering with candlelight, Tyler Sanders had ordered her to carry a serving tray loaded with twice its normal weight, and laughed loud and delighted when her knees buckled in front of the guests. "Look at the fat maid trying. She's ruining the whole atmosphere the boss paid for." Nobody had objected. Audrey Collins, the head housekeeper, had only glanced over and turned away the way she always did. But the tray had not been what left the bruises. After the last guest's car pulled away down the gravel drive, Tyler had found her alone in the service corridor, gathering empty glasses. He'd grabbed her by the collar and shoved her back against the wall, his breath sour with wine, warning her that if she ever looked at him the way she had at dinner, like she pitied him, he'd make sure she regretted it long before her sister ever saw another dialysis machine. His hand had closed around her throat just long enough to leave a message. Then he'd let go and walked away, straightening his cuffs as if nothing at all had happened. That was the moment Sadie understood something she would never say out loud in this house. Her body was simply part of the furniture, to be used and marked as anyone with enough rank pleased. The heavy oak door of the kitchen swung open without warning. Graham Reynolds stepped through it. His white shirt hung open at the collar, tie long gone, a nearly empty glass of whiskey in one hand. His eyes were pale, cold, and tired in a way that made him look older than 33. The tired of a Mafia boss who had spent the whole night pretending a room full of dangerous men still trusted him. Sadie spun toward the sink, yanking at her torn collar, her whole body locking rigid. Graham said nothing. He studied her for a long moment, then walked around the center island and stopped exactly 2 steps away from her. He reached behind himself and turned the deadbolt. The click was small, mechanical, and absolute. And in that silence, it sounded like a gunshot. "Look at me," he said. His voice was low, not angry, impossible to refuse. Sadie turned. The fluorescent light fell directly across the swelling on her cheek and the bruises circling her throat. Graham's gaze dropped to her apron pocket, where the fabric pulsed faintly with the vibration of a phone still recording inside it. "What are you hiding in there?" he asked. He reached out and took the phone before she could stop him, his thumb finding the pause button, but not before the speaker released the last few seconds of the recording into the silent kitchen. It wasn't only Tyler Sanders' voice. Beneath it, quieter, was Audrey Collins murmuring, "Just let it go. Don't get involved." Both of them went still. The head housekeeper had known, and she had chosen silence for who knew how long. Graham looked at Sadie a moment longer, his voice dropping colder. "How many people in this house have watched you get hurt and turned away?" He didn't return the phone. He slid it into his inside jacket pocket and took one more step forward, close enough that Sadie's back pressed against the edge of the sink. The kitchen, which had felt dangerous with the door locked, now felt more dangerous still. And yet, for the first time in 3 years, she did not feel invisible. Graham still held her phone, his eyes never leaving her face. The screen lit up on its own, a message from Mission Hospital sliding across the top. Stella Whitaker, Thursday, dialysis appointment confirmed. Please remit payment within 48 hours. Sadie saw it and went still. She didn't cry. She only whispered, her voice hoarse. Please don't fire me. My sister has 11 more treatments before she even qualifies for a transplant. 3 months earlier, when Sadie had first asked for an advance on her wages to cover Stella's hospital bill, Tyler had thrown the paperwork onto the kitchen floor in front of the entire staff, loud enough for everyone to hear. Someone like you wants an advance. We don't feed parasites here. What Sadie remembered most, though, wasn't Tyler's voice. It was Audrey Collins, standing 3 feet away with the denial form already in her hand, signing it without once looking up. Graham gestured toward the steel chair by the island. Sit down. She sat. He leaned back against the counter and pressed play on the recording, 7 minutes and 14 seconds of it, filling the quiet kitchen. Tyler's voice came through clear and ugly, threatening her sister's care if she didn't stay quiet and cooperate. Graham switched it off. How long has Tyler known you have a sister? Since my first day, Sadie said flat, now unflinching. He said he'd help me arrange things if I behaved. She looked down, then reached into the lining of her shoe and pulled out a small USB drive wrapped in plastic. She set it on the counter. That's only the main copy. A backup's been hidden in the cleaning cart since my 2nd week here. If you hadn't asked tonight, I'd have kept it until my sister finished her transplant. Graham looked at the drive for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. No longer the look of a man defending an employee, but the look of a mafia boss, realizing the woman in front of him had been quietly preparing for a war of her own, alone, for a very long time. He slid the drive into his jacket next to the phone. You don't have to prepare alone anymore, he said. But you'll pay for that, with staying. He stopped at the door, not unlocking it yet. Don't leave this kitchen until I come back. If anyone knocks, don't open it. Alone, Sadie sat, with her hands clenched in her lap. She thought of her mother, gone 11 years now, and of the silver necklace she had never once taken off since. She thought of Stella, asleep and unaware that her sister had just handed a mafia boss the only leverage either of them had left. She had spent 3 years believing survival meant staying invisible. Some part of her, the part that had hidden a second copy of that recording before she'd even finished her first month of work, had never quite believed that story. Sadie hid evidence for months instead of going straight to Graham. Was that smart self-protection from a woman who'd learned to trust no one? Or did her silence let Tyler hurt her longer than it should have? Pick a side in the comments. She was right to wait, or she waited too long, and tell us why. 40 minutes later, every senior man under Graham's command was summoned to the second-floor conference room. 4 in the morning. 20 men in dark suits stood around a long oak table in silence, the overhead lights bright enough to catch every tired, unshaven face in the room. No one spoke. No one dared shift their weight on the old hardwood, which creaked under the smallest movement. Tyler Sanders was pushed into the center of the room, his face pale, his shirt still creased from the night before. He tried for a moment to summon the same easy contempt he'd used on Sadie at dinner, his chin lifting, a half-smile forming, but it collapsed the instant his eyes found Graham's face across the table. Whatever he saw there wiped the smile clean off. Graham set a blank sheet of paper and a pen in front of him. Sign it. A public confession of debt. Graham? Tyler started, and the name came out wrong. Too familiar, grasping for an old friendship that no longer had any weight in this room. Before Tyler could reach for the pen, Graham placed a thin black folder on the table, the sound of it hitting the wood sharp enough to make 2 of the younger men flinch. 3 months ago, I already had evidence you moved 2.7 million through a shell account in Charlotte. I was waiting for a reason personal enough that no one in this room would think to question it. A reason that had nothing to do with money at all. Tonight, you gave me that reason. The room went silent enough to hear the breathing of the men closest to him. Somewhere down the hall, a clock ticked absurdly ordinary against the tension in the room. Tyler's hand shook as he signed the pen, scratching too loud against the paper, his signature coming out jagged, barely legible, a small, ugly echo of every steady, cruel gesture he'd made toward Sadie for 3 years. Graham gave a single nod. 2 men escorted Tyler out through the back exit. No one asked questions. No one watched him go. Outside in the hallway, Sadie, who had slipped up from the kitchen against Graham's order, unable to sit still any longer, overheard 2 guards whispering about her, their words cruel, in the same familiar way she'd learned to brace against months ago. One of them muttered something about how far she must have crawled to land herself under the boss's protection. The old Sadie would have shrunk into the wall until they passed. This time, she didn't go back in. She chose silence, because right now, silence was the last piece of power she had left to hold on to, and because she had learned the hard way that giving cruel men a reaction was the only thing that ever fed them. 14 minutes later, Graham returned to the kitchen, a thin smear of drying blood on his cuff, not his own. She would understand only later. He set her phone down in front of her, screen still dark. Your sister's bill has been handled. The hospital will show full payment before 9 this morning. You stay here until I say you're free to go. He didn't sit. He stood at a small distance, arms crossed, studying her the way a man studies a room he's about to leave, for the last time as it currently exists. There's one more person in this house who's known for a long time and said nothing. I'm going to see her now. Graham found Audrey Collins already awake, sitting stiff-backed at her small desk, as if she'd been waiting for this exact hour her whole career. A woman who had learned 19 years ago that the sound of footsteps in the night rarely brought good news, and had trained herself never to be caught looking surprised by it. He set his phone down and played 4 seconds of the recording, just enough for her own whispered words to fill the room. Just let it go. Don't get involved. Audrey didn't deny it. Her hands folded on the desk in front of her didn't move, though her knuckles paled slightly around each other. I've worked in this house 19 years, she said quietly. I learned a long time ago that surviving here meant not seeing things. You'll keep your position, Graham said, because replacing you creates more questions than I want asked right now. But you will never again decide what's worth seeing in my house. If it happens again, anything to anyone, I won't be nearly this patient. He walked out without waiting for a response, the door clicking shut behind him with none of the finality of the deadbolt in the kitchen, just an ordinary door in an ordinary hallway, closing on a woman who understood exactly how much had just changed. Audrey isn't a villain. She's a woman who learned the same way Sadie once had, that silence was the price of staying employed in a house like this one. But where Sadie's silence was a shield, she was building toward something. Audrey's had calcified into complicity. Graham doesn't punish her for being afraid. He punishes her for deciding on Sadie's behalf that fear was an acceptable reason to do nothing. It's the same lesson he's about to learn about himself 3 weeks from now, standing in front of an open safe. By the time Graham reached the basement kitchen again, dawn was still hours away, but something in the house had already changed, quietly, permanently, the way ice changes before it ever visibly cracks. He paused in the doorway before she noticed him, just long enough to watch her turn the silver pendant over between her fingers again, tracing those same worn engravings without seeming to know she was doing it. Something about the gesture caught at him, faint and formless, like a name on the tip of his tongue he couldn't yet place. He said nothing of it. Not yet. Word moved fast in a house built on whispers, and somewhere out past the estate's gates, men who had once taken Tyler Sanders' money were about to learn that the man who paid them no longer existed. 3 days passed before Sadie understood what that silence would cost. Those 3 days did not feel like relief. They felt like the house holding its breath. Meals were served on time. The hallways were swept twice a day, same as always. But Sadie noticed the small things a woman who has survived on vigilance always notices. The security detail rotating their shifts an hour earlier than usual. 2 guards she'd never seen speak to each other, now sharing cigarettes by the east gate at dawn, their voices dropping the moment her shadow crossed the window. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Petrov, who used to nod at her in the mornings, stopped nodding entirely. He looked through her instead, the way men look through furniture they're planning to move out of a room. She mentioned it to no one. Old habits die slower than old bruises. Graham noticed too, though he said less about it than she expected. On the second night, she found him standing at the study window long after midnight, a glass of whiskey untouched on the sill beside him, his eyes fixed on the tree line at the edge of the property. "Tyler paid for loyalty the way he paid for everything," he said without turning around. "Cheap, and only halfway." It was the closest he came to admitting he felt it too, that ripple moving under the surface of the house, patient and quiet, waiting for a signal. Tyler's disappearance had rippled outward past the estate walls, reaching men who'd been quietly paid to look the other way months earlier. Half of Graham's own security detail bought and waiting for a signal that had finally come. When their patron never checked in, they didn't wait for orders. They acted. Friday night, close to midnight, the estate sat wrapped in a false, brittle quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. The kind that makes a person's own footsteps sound too loud. Sadie was in the second-floor laundry room folding towels, out of habit. Habit was the only thing keeping her hands steady lately. When a heavy explosion tore through the first floor, the sound arrived before her mind could name it. A concussive thud that traveled up through the floorboards and into her teeth, followed half a second later by the shriek of glass. The laundry room window shattered, spraying the folding table in a glittering sheet. The lights flickered once, twice, then held. Somewhere below, a woman screamed, one of the kitchen staff, and then didn't scream again. Sadie's ears rang. Her hands, still damp from the wash basin, wouldn't stop shaking as she pressed them flat against the folding table to steady herself. Smoke, thin and acrid, curled up the stairwell. She ran into the hallway and found Graham braced against the wall, the left side of his shirt soaked dark, a pistol still in his hand. In the low emergency lighting, his face had gone the color of the ash in the basement kitchen 3 nights ago. The same pale, drawn look she'd once mistaken for exhaustion. This was blood loss. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped along the side of it, and when his eyes found her in the smoke, something in them cracked open for just a fraction of a second. Fear not for himself. "Down," he said, voice tight. "Now." Figures in black surged up the main staircase, the very men who'd been trusted to guard the house. Petrov was among them. He didn't look through her this time. He looked straight at her, and there was nothing left in his face that remembered nodding to her in the mornings. One of them recognized her and sneered, calling out loud enough for the hallway to hear that she'd run too far to matter now that the maid who'd thought herself untouchable was about to learn different. His boots hit the landing hard, deliberate, unhurried, the way a man walks when he believes the outcome is already decided. She didn't strike blindly. 3 nights earlier, mopping the staircase long after the house had gone quiet, she'd overheard 2 guards talking low, thinking no one was listening. The security chief's bad left knee, an old injury from a settlement gone wrong in Charlotte. The kind of detail that never mattered to anyone until suddenly it did. She had filed it away, the way she filed everything away, without knowing why. The same instinct that had made her hide a second copy of a recording in a cleaning cart. She aimed for exactly that knee. The glass drove deep. The man's leg buckled beneath him with a sound like a door coming off its hinge, and he collapsed his gun, clattering away across the hard wood. The gap it created gave Graham just enough room to pull her into the master bedroom, his good arm wrapping hard around her waist, half carrying her the last few feet. He kicked the door shut behind them. The bedroom, so calm and ordinary in daylight, now strobed with the orange light of something burning downstairs, shadows jumping across the walls with each pulse. He dragged her toward the stone fireplace, breathing in short, controlled bursts through his teeth, and pressed a hidden panel in the wall. A false stone door swung open onto a narrow safe room, cool air spilling out of it, smelling faintly of old paper and gun oil. Inside, the light was dim and red, thrown from a single emergency bulb overhead. Graham noticed a silver necklace slipping loose from the collar of her torn uniform, and for half a second, something on its back caught the light. A scatter of tiny engraved marks he didn't have time to read. He froze anyway, one hand still braced against the doorframe, blood dripping steadily from his fingertips onto the stone floor. "Whose is that?" "My mother's," Sadie said, her voice barely above the ringing in her own ears. "She died when I was 15. Graham's voice came out strange, distant, like a man listening to himself from underwater. "I think I know that necklace." What Graham wants in this exact second is simple. Get her behind steel before he bleeds out. What he gets instead is a memory trying to surface through the pain. Something about that necklace, scratching at a door he's kept locked since he was 22. He doesn't chase it. Survival wins, for now. But the part of him that has spent his whole adult life refusing to feel anything he can't control has just met something he can't file away and ignore. Whatever blood connected them had just begun to surface in the middle of a fight for their lives. He bolted the stone door from the inside, the mechanism sealing shut with a heavy final sound, and slid down against it, one hand pressed hard to his side. Sadie tore a strip from her ruined apron without being told and pressed it against the wound, her bloodied palm shaking against his ribs. Outside the stone door, muffled but unmistakable, came the sound of boots, then gunfire, then a long silence that was somehow worse than the noise. "If I don't make it out," he said, his voice weakening from blood loss, his eyes fighting to stay on her face instead of sliding shut. "Look at what's carved on the back of that. It opens something I've never let anyone open." "You're going to tell me yourself?" Sadie said, and pressed harder against the wound, as if she could hold him there by sheer will alone. 2 hours later, the all-clear signal crackled through the internal radio, a clipped voice reading off a code Sadie didn't understand but recognized instantly as safety. The stone door opened. Graham stepped out first, one hand still braced against the frame, favoring his side. Sadie stayed close behind, close enough that her shoulder brushed his good arm the whole way down the hall, as though letting go of him even by a few inches felt like a risk she wasn't willing to take. The estate reeked of gunpowder and burnt wood, the smell thick enough to taste. Someone had already swept broken glass into a pile along the baseboard, an oddly domestic gesture in the middle of so much wreckage. The bodies of the traitors had already been carried down to the lower level. A cleaning crew Sadie didn't recognize moved through the halls with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before and would likely do it again. Graham stopped in the ruined hallway and turned to face her, the emergency lights overhead casting hard shadows under his eyes. "You can go. The hospital bill is covered for 3 years. No one is keeping you here." It was said flatly, almost like a formality he felt obligated to offer, and Sadie heard underneath it the shape of a question he wasn't willing to ask out loud. She looked at the surviving guards along the hallway, They no longer sneered. They avoided her eyes the way people avoid an open flame, not afraid of her exactly, but of what she now represented. Petrov was not among them. No one mentioned his name, and no one would again. She didn't move to leave. She unclasped the necklace and placed it gently into Graham's bloodied palm, her fingers lingering half a second longer than necessary against his skin. "I'm not leaving." Graham looked at the necklace, then at her, something unguarded crossing his face for the first time since she'd met him. "You know who I am, and you still want to stay." "I know," she said without hesitation. The hallway light caught the back of the pendant, and this time Graham saw it clearly. 7 tiny engraved digits, worn nearly smooth from years against someone's skin. He knew that sequence. It was the combination to the old safe in his father's study, the one that had sat untouched behind a false panel since before Graham had ever been trusted to know it existed. He'd walked past that panel 1,000 times as a boy, without knowing what it held. And some part of him, standing here, bleeding in a hallway that smelled of smoke, understood that the answer had been hanging around a stranger's neck the entire time he'd known her. His hand closed around the necklace until his knuckles went pale. She wasn't only carrying her mother's memory. She was carrying the last piece he'd need to finish settling accounts with whoever remained from a debt 11 years old. Graham didn't say anything else. He pulled her close, blood from his wound soaking into her uniform, his heartbeat rough and uneven against her ear. For the first time, the distance between a mafia boss and a housemaid dissolved completely, in silence amid the wreckage of a house that had nearly killed them both. He murmured into her hair, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "From now on, you're not someone I protect. You're someone I need." She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, letting the weight of him lean into her, listening to his breathing, steady by degrees, and thought, distantly, the way a person thinks something true only once the danger has passed, that this was the first time in 3 years she'd been held instead of grabbed. In the days that followed, the house began to change. Audrey Collins, already confronted once, offered no further defense when word of the necklace and the safe reached her. Something in her demeanor shifted permanently, the quiet understanding that her silence had finally cost her the one thing she'd protected for 19 years. The illusion that not seeing was the same as not knowing. Sadie didn't ask anyone in the house for an apology. She didn't need one. She had spent 3 years absorbing cruelty from people who mistook her silence for weakness. She understood now that her silence had never been weakness. It had been the only form of control available to a woman with nothing else to protect herself with, used exactly as long as she needed it, and not 1 day longer. 3 weeks after the attack, the estate had been mostly repaired. The smell of fresh paint replaced the old scent of blood in the hallways, and someone had planted new flowers along the front walk where the explosion had scorched the grass. Sadie never asked whose idea that had been, though she suspected she already knew. Sadie no longer wore the gray uniform. She'd been moved to a private room in the East Wing, still within the grounds, but no longer beneath it in every sense that mattered. Stella had been transferred to a private suite at Mission Hospital, her care paid in full for years to come. On the phone, Stella's voice had sounded lighter than Sadie had heard it in over a year, asking questions about the big house on a hill her sister now lived in, half joking, half hoping it was true. One quiet evening, Graham found Sadie in the estate's library. The tall windows dark against the reading lamps, the only sound, the soft tick of the old clock on the mantel. He didn't say, "Stay with me." He set down a cup of black coffee made exactly the way she used to prepare it for him at 4 in the morning, and sat across from her, close enough that his knee brushed the edge of the low table between them. Then he opened the old safe from his father's study right there in front of her. The hinges gave a dry, reluctant groan, a sound that seemed to carry 11 years of being ignored. Inside wasn't only an old execution order bearing the Whitaker name. There was a handwritten letter addressed from Sadie's mother to Graham's father. "I know you mean to kill me, but your son asleep down the hall, he's done nothing. Whatever debt you think I owe you, don't make him pay it too." Beside it sat a faded photograph, a young man in his early 20s, unmistakably Graham, standing beside the same woman moments before everything in that house changed forever. Graham's hand, steady through gunfire 3 weeks ago, shook now over a piece of paper. He read it twice, his eyes moving slower the second time, as if trying to make the words say something less unbearable. He understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that he had lived to become who he was only because a woman he'd been taught to fear had once tried to shield him from his own father. Blood he'd been raised to think of as an enemy's blood had in fact been the blood that spared him. He sank into the chair, the cold composure he'd worn his entire adult life finally breaking apart in front of another person. "I gave the order that killed the woman who saved my life," he said, his voice barely holding together. "I didn't even know it. That doesn't make it less true." Sadie stood still. She didn't step closer, and she didn't step away. She only looked at him with a steadiness that gave him nowhere left to hide. "You didn't know," she said quietly. "A man who was 22 sleeping down the hall doesn't carry that guilt. The men who gave the order do. And you weren't one of them yet." Just then, Stella arrived for a visit brought up from the hospital wing by one of the staff, her laugh still trailing behind her from something one of the nurses had said in the car. She spotted the old photograph still lying on the desk and spoke with the easy, unfiltered honesty of a 19-year-old. "The woman in that picture, she looks so much like Mom. She used to tell me she worked in a big house on a hill before she passed." Both Graham and Sadie went still. The last layer of the secret surrounding Sadie's mother had not closed after all. It had only opened wider. Graham reached out and touched the bare skin at Sadie's throat, where the necklace used to rest. He didn't kiss her. He made no promises. He simply let his hand stay there longer than necessary, as if confirming a new truth settling into place between them. Outside the library window, the first light of morning rose over the pines. "Tomorrow, I'll burn that letter," Graham said, quiet enough for only her to hear. "But I will never burn the memory that you're the reason I'm still standing." In the weeks that followed, the estate slowly stopped feeling like a house built on fear. Sadie still carried everything she had endured, but she carried it differently now, the way a person carries a scar they've made peace with, rather than one they're still hiding. She had once believed dignity meant staying small and silent. She understood now that dignity was the thing that remained standing, unbroken, even after every cruel word and every closed door. This story reminds us that the people who hurt us rarely get to decide what we're worth. Only we do, and usually much later than we'd like. If you've spent years being the one who smooths things over, who apologizes first, who keeps the peace at your own expense, it's worth asking, gently, what that silence actually bought you, and whether you still need to pay that price. For anyone who's lost a spouse or built a life around caring for someone else, the hardest habit to unlearn is disappearing so the household stays calm. But a Tuesday phone call to an old friend you've been meaning to reach, or finally saying no to a family favor that always falls on you, does more for a person's spirit than waiting to feel ready ever will. Write down one thing this week you stayed quiet about that you didn't need to. Then say it out loud to someone who deserves to hear it. Small, plain courage, repeated often enough, is what quietly rebuilds a person, not a single grand transformation. but the sum of 100 small refusals to shrink. Graham says a 22-year-old can't carry guilt for an order he never gave, but he still calls himself the man who signed it. Do you believe someone can be innocent of a crime and still owe a debt for it? Tell us which side you land on and why in the comments below. And if Sadie and Graham's story moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more.